Hi, I'll start again. This is Reverend Bud Heckman. I serve as the president of the Board of Governors for the Religion Communicators Council. I'm so glad to have you all join us today for our webinar with J. Tobin Grant. He is a political scientist, a professor and head of the department at Southern Illinois University. He also serves as a contributor to and a data specialist for the Religion News Service, which is associated with the Religion News Association, Religion News Foundation. And I first was caught up with Tobin and his work because I saw him respond a few different times on Twitter to people who were actually sharing data about things that had to do with religion and changes in social culture. And Tobin actually made some deeper insights about the way in which people were reading data in such a way that I thought was actually interesting. And I thought, here's a person who actually knows and understands better how to look at data and research in a way that would help inform how we talk about it as communicators about religion. So I engaged with him in a little bit of conversation about that, and I thought it would be terrific to actually have him come and join us and share a little bit about his work and how we all might better understand how to read data and statistical research. So I'm thankful for so many of you joining on with us here today. And without too much ado, we'll move to Tobin. I will share with you, we already have an additional webinar that's lined up, but not until September. In early September, we'll have Ryan Koch with us, and will be talking about different means for advancing the way in which you have a social media presence. But we're very pleased to have with us today J. Tobin Grant. He's going to share with you a presentation. During the time of his presentation, those of you who are joining on online, I'm encouraging you to enter your questions into the chat box so we might feed them better to Tobin at the end of his presentation, but we'll go to an open Q&A after he's talked with us a bit. And for those of you who are on the phone lines, at some point towards the end, I hope to open up so that those of you who are joining by phone might be able to share questions as well. But there is a little chat box that's at the bottom of the Zoom that allows you to submit questions. And if you have individual problems, you can just send me an individual message. I'll try to help you with your connection and what have you. But without further ado, Tobin, thank you for being with us, and tell us a little bit about yourself before you begin.
Yeah, no, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and hear some of your questions. And I've got a little first, some background on me. My education put on here because I went to undergraduate at Wheaton College, and there I worked with Bud Kelstead, who did a lot of early work in survey research and religion. And then I went to Ohio State University where I did political science, and there it's a very data-driven sort of program, very quantitative study. But even though it's political science, I always still had a foot in studying religion as well. I've been at Southern Illinois University since 2001, so I spent my entire career here as a professor. About 2009, I actually had my first kind of entry into doing public writing and public communicating. I started writing I'm not even sure what to call it. It was kind of vloggy, kind of columny, kind of news reports covering politics for Christianity Today. So obviously an evangelical audience. But as part of that, started learning the ropes on how to communicate data findings into public discourse. And so it turned out to be really tricky. And so there's some tricks to it that I'm happy to share as we go through this. After the 2012 election, took some time off, but then got invited to join Religion News Service. And there I had a blog, now a column, that's called Corner of Church and State, which was kind of a misnomer. It was a lot of, again, bringing religion research and data to public conversations. And so kind of try to described it as a data-driven conversation about religion. I've just so you know, I've stopped doing that as of December. Even though you can still find my stuff on RNS's site, in part because I'm now the full-time editor of the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, and that was just taking up too much time to do both. But I still have a real concern and a real interest in being part of conversations about religion and bringing data to bear on it. The problem that we have with, how do we bring data and research into religious storytelling is really a couple things. And I think that, this none of this should be surprising, but it's, I think, important to kind of lay out where I'm coming from on this. We have two very different skill sets. One is the ability to communicate to the public. So being able to write clearly, all the skills that good communicators, good journalists have. And then there's this other ability that's out there, that's the ability to analyze data and to do the number crunching and to do the academic side of research. And journalists, PR, other communicators really have honed their skills on the ability to communicate to the public. And it's not, and as you well know, it's not just a matter of just writing, but it's a matter of trying to figure out how to understand something and then figure out the best way to bring that understanding to other people. Academics, on the other hand, have this great ability to analyze data and do all that number crunching stuff. But I almost put academics on the left side of that arrow just to show how bad they were at communicating. And so if you guys have ever tried to deal with people who are academics, in fact, there's actually books on how to teach social scientists how to write. And the first lesson is go back to your freshman English class. Remember all those lessons you learned? Yeah, you've forgotten it all, because part of being an academic is sometimes learning how to write badly over again. Now, there have been some ways of kind of linking the two together. One is a trend that you'd be aware of in journalism, to start hiring positions of data editors, people who are doing investigative reporting or data crunching, data science, to try to bring data to bear on news articles. And these are primarily so in positions where people have some data skills, but they're also very good at writing. There's also a series of academic bloggers that are out there. In political science, the most famous one that we have is the Monkey Cage blog, which is at Washington Post, which has political scientists writing all the time, daily, on topics that are related to the news, but they're bringing their academic expertise. So where the data editors are kind of within journalism and within communication, but have the data skills. These are ones have academic training, but are getting their feet wet in public communication. One of the frustrating parts about dealing with academics is that journalists and people involved in communication have a focus on general-wide knowledge. So if you talk to a typical journalist, they're writing on topic one on Tuesday. On Thursday, they're talking about a different topic. And even if they have a beat, like they're covering the God beat, or if they're sports writers or whatever, their topics are changing literally daily. Whereas academics their kind of coin to the realm is their expertise, and so having very narrow knowledge. And so trying to meld those two can be quite a challenge. The other part of it too that I think is important, particularly whenever you're dealing with data, okay, is that there's this comparison. It was called the signal to noise ratio, meaning that if you have, when you're dealing with data, the way that people who deal with statistics and data often, what we're looking for is kind of the general pattern that you can find there, and are less concerned and trying to avoid the noise or the kind of randomness that's out there. And I've got this, albeit wonky explanation or example for you. Okay, so this is something that's got a lot of numbers on it that you can ignore, but here's the key thing, is that political scientists can take all kinds of votes that people do in Congress, and they'll run it through an algorithm, and they'll do this number crunching, and they will assign people from left to right, and there's a little bit more variation up to down. And this is the US Senate last year. So all the D's are Democrats, all the R's are Republicans. And this was an analysis done of the vote for the Iran agreement that was last September, I guess a year ago, September. And the people in blue voted against it. People in red voted for it. I think it needed like 2/3 to pass. And then the picture on the right is just the people who voted against what the statistical model would predict. And so you can see the people on one side of the line are red and the other side are blue. The reason why I put this up here is that, so this is taking literally hundreds of votes, crunching the numbers, getting some type of score for ideology, and then using that to help explain something. For a political scientist looking at this, what they're looking for is, does our model predict a lot of the cases? And the answer is yes. Or I guess this is in the House, not the Senate. The answer is yes. But to a journalist, though, what they're often interested in is both the general pattern to an extent, but oftentimes why do we get these errors? So in other words, they're interested in some of the noise, some of the specific cases, whereas researchers are willing to push that stuff aside. So in this case, I had written a story that used this data and then focused in on, all right, so who are these blue Ds that are on here? And the ones that we would have think ideologically have voted for the deal, but then voted against it. Not surprisingly, what most of these Democrats were Northeast Democrats, primarily from areas with high Jewish populations that were voting against it. And in the Senate, Chuck Schumer would have been one case of this. And some of the Ds on the other side were just more as moderate as the Democrats got in voting with their Republican colleagues. But the reason I put this up here is that to kind of point out that there's one of the things with dealing with data is realizing that there are two different goals here, that where on academic side there and the data number crunching people, they're trying to figure out kind of what's the pattern that's there in all the noise of the data. But sometimes the more interesting stories are the people who are different from that norm. I think that the sweet spot for people who are trying to bring in data into a story is to understand, okay, I want to go to academics and researchers and get the data so I can understand what the big picture is and what the general patterns are. And then whenever I'm dealing with individual cases, I'll better know, is this person typical of what we see? And you can explain, and they become an example of what might be typical, or are they really someone who deviates away and are unusual on that? So, for example, if you look at the last presidential election, white voters who identify as born again, 81% in the exit polls voted for Trump. So if you're talking to someone who fits that description, but they were adamantly against Donald Trump, then you know that they're against the general trend. And that's a data point that most of us are aware of. But you could do that with other things too, so that you can say, okay, is this person typical of this? How different are they away from this? And be able to explain, here's the general pattern, and here's the big explanation for what's going on. Now, here's some individual things that I can then use to explain that, or to show how there's differences from that, and understand that there are differences, and that just because you have a general pattern of the data, that you don't have a lot of variation around it. And one of the things I think that happens best whenever you're dealing with data is that you're able to take the data and figure out what is the story. And what I had always tried to do is I kind of think visually anyway. And so, but there's also a thing that, can we show this in a graphic format, the data? And if you can, then oftentimes that can then be a story that then can help explain a lot of things. And so kind of moving away from tried to having to explain everything. If you have to explain everything in the writing, that's probably too complicated. But if you can give people a table or graph that then they can refer to, then you're focusing your attention on what's the big story, then that's a lot helpful. So just to give you 3 examples that work pretty well for me. Here is a graph of religion in the Supreme Court. So this was whenever, I think I put this together whenever Scalia died. And so the bluish is the Protestant. So you go up to nine people. Red is Catholic. The yellowish is Jewish. And this showing you from 1870 up through the present. And by putting the data in this way, it's pretty easy to see what the major story is, which is that you had all Protestant up until the late 1800s, that you had the introduction of a couple of Catholic members, then one Jewish member, occasionally 2. 1970s, you had a little break from that, but then starting in the 1990s, an increasing number of Catholics and an increasing number of Jewish, and a complete elimination of Protestants from it. And so you go from 1870 being an all Protestant Supreme Court to the current state. Gorsuch actually would be the now token Protestant member that's on the Supreme Court, with the rest being Catholic or Jewish. And so if you're talking about religious changes in the Supreme Court, this one picture kind of lays that out for you. Here's a different kind of graph. I will say that this one's a little bit more technical to put together, but it was kind of fun. This is using the general social surveys for the past decade or so. And it asked people what religion they were when they were 16, and then what religion they are today. And I was particularly interested in where the Southern Baptists, because you have conversations on Southern Baptist membership declining and kind of where are they going to, and there's all sorts of different things that people had going to it. And what this graph shows is that on the left-hand side is where people were at 16, and then it flows over to where they are now. And so, in fact, you have probably a majority of Southern Baptists that are at 16 are still Southern Baptists today. But when they flow off of that, they either become other Baptists, like an independent Baptist, become other evangelicals, other Protestants, a few Catholics, a few other non-Christian religions, and a pretty good segment to say that they're no religion. But at the same time, they're also picking up people who are from other Baptists, other evangelicals, but just not to the same degree. And so again, the point here is to, how can I get the data and be able to tell a story that then goes with this and be able to explain the general pattern. This last one's just a traditional kind of bar graph. And the point here was really twofold, which was the 2 parts of the stories, because this had to do with opposition to the death penalty, was, are there religious differences that we can see, which we can, to a degree, in terms of, so this is the percent supporting the death penalty in cases where there's murder. Okay, so 75% of, let's say here, Catholics who don't attend church agree with that, but Catholics who attend church is 50%. So the main thing was to show, okay, where are the differences between evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, those in historically Black churches, and Catholics, but then also show the effect of that in each of the groups. You see that people who are more religious, who attend church more frequently, are less supportive of the death penalty. So that you have both religious differences as well as differences within religions on how often they attend. And so that was the main part of that story. And this kind of data becomes particularly useful whenever you're dealing with what I would refer to as religious elites, pastors, spokespersons, people at magazines, who typically be these kind of lighter blue because they're the most religious, and might be very different from people who are marginally active in their religious tradition. The other thing I would point out, and this is something that we'll deal with that I'd be happy to deal with more is one of the dangers that whenever you're doing data, and one of the things that Bud mentioned is being really cognizant of what data you're using, and realizing that just because the same term might be used in one data set or in one author, that's be different from the other one. So in this one, evangelical and mainline, these are ones that get thrown around quite a bit. But what people mean by it can be very different. So in a lot of your public polling, PRRI, Pew, exit polls, they use a rather blunt measure of just asking people if they're Christian. Then they ask them if they're born again or evangelical, and if they're yes, and they go in this, but they would also only include whites in the evangelical category. They would describe mainline as anybody who didn't say that they were born again or evangelical and are white, so in other words, you could be Southern Baptist or Assemblies of God and be considered mainline Protestant just because you didn't say that you were evangelical. They would exclude historically black. Anybody who's black goes into the black Christian or black Protestant category. And there's some reasons for doing that. A lot of it has to do with cost of the surveys. But for example, in this one, because I'm using a different type of instrument, using the General Social Survey, Pew Landscape Study would also have this specificity. It's using denomination. And then if you use something else like Barna would come out with something, and when they talk about evangelicals, they're talking about 4 or 5% of the population who deal and can check off a certain number of right beliefs or behaviors that they consider rightly evangelical. In some categories like Catholic, you don't have this problem, but with Protestants, because it's so disorganized, you can have that. And it's just a warning that in this particular case, you have it, but you can also have that anytime you're dealing with data, that just because you're going from one expert to another, you need to make sure that you're talking about the same categories. I will show this. I can come back to it. This is what I humbly refer to as the best religion politics graph ever. All right, so which means it's mine. But it's also just to show you how this is one that I had a lot of positive feedback on. This is using Pew's data. And what this is, just to show you how much you can do with data and just let it tell the story, is that, so this is a map that basically goes from, on the left are people who want more government services. On the right are people who want less government services. People at the top want more involvement of government in morality. Bottom, people want less protection from morality. Each circle represents a religious group or denomination or church. So that big one in the middle is Catholic. Here's the big yellow one here is nothing in particular. United Methodist, one of these red ones. The size of the circle tells you how big they are in terms of the size of the population. So you have some small ones up here, evangelical ones, larger mainline denomination in the bottom right. The different colors represent what religious tradition they are. So the reddish ones are mainline Protestant. The yellows are people with no religion. Historically black Protestant are up in this upper left. They're green. The darker blue are evangelical. And what you can do with this is, in one graph, be able to say, okay, look for your particular group that you're interested in, be able to tell where they are in terms of as a group ideologically, as well as know what religious tradition they are, as well as know how big they are. And so you can spend a lot of time looking at it and wondering, okay, why are Jewish conservative and Orthodox Jews up here, but the other Jewish are down here? Why do we have differences within Black Protestantism and other ones? So if you're interested in this, you can easily, if you type in ideology and my name, it'll pop up online. Happy to send it to you as well. Okay, so some practical advice on kind of how to include data and research into your religious storytelling. And I'd be happy to answer questions on this, but just some general stuff. All right. The key thing that I think you should do is, unless you are very comfortable doing the data analysis yourself, is that you're going to have to rely on other people to do it and to communicate it to you. And the best way to do that is to actually just talk to someone who actually does the data analysis. You're welcome to contact me. I'd be willing to point you to other people as well. But the key thing is to understand what you want. And what I think what you really should be striving for anytime that you're dealing with data is try to figure out what's the big picture. What is the big pattern that you can see? What are the things that people who are in the field generally agree to? Don't get into the small nuances unless they're really critical. I mentioned like measuring who's an evangelical might be one of those. And there's other things like that, but just realizing what is the big picture, right? So if you talk to someone, try to figure out what's the big thing. People who are researchers are going to be focused on explanations, relationships between things. So when you ask them, well, all right, so why does this occur? Then listen to their explanations for it. And if you're going to use charts and tables or try to read them for what you need is that you're going to need ones that provide what we call descriptive statistics. That's just a term of art that we have, is that this is things like what percentage of different people in different groups, counts, things that you would put in a pie graph, even though you don't ever do a pie graph, but that's a different story. A bar graph, because if you pick up an academic article, oftentimes you'll see tables with numbers and they're just difficult to interpret. I will let that interpretation go to someone who's really used to looking at it. And those are really hard to communicate as well. But typical things that you really understand, things like percentages or averages and things like that. What you want to avoid is getting into the weeds, particularly in the communication. You might want that stuff on background to understand that there might be some big disagreements in the field of what you're trying to study. But unless it's central to your story, try to stay out of it and try to keep going back to what's the big picture, what can everyone avoid. Try to get people to not use jargon, which people tend to rely on, and particularly if they're not used to public communication. I have this thing called statistical significance, and this is, let me just briefly explain this. Sometimes you have differences. Anytime you do a survey or data, you're going to find differences between things. The question is, are those differences real or not? And so when you see polls during an election or something, they'll oftentimes say, this is within the margin of error. These two candidates, one has 48%, one has 49%, but that's within the margin of error. That's that difference. If there's an actual difference there that's real and goes beyond what we'd see kind of randomly, that's called statistical significance. Oftentimes there are things that you might see that don't rise that level, so they look different, but they're really not. The people at PRI, Pew does this, I've had to deal with this, is what do you do in those cases? Just let people kind of explain to you, and what they'll say is like, all right, here are the real differences, here are the ones that aren't real. I'll tell you that if you pick up something that Pew presents, so if you grab one of their reports, they only report like findings that are statistically significant. If they're not, they just don't report them, even though they could. They don't go into the details of this is why we're not reporting it, but that's what they're doing. If you're looking for data or looking for experts, one of the best things that you can do is find somebody that you know that isn't an expert, even if they're not in that field, and ask them who they think might be really good for you to contact, and ask for recommendations. So it'd also be good too, like if you go, like, I don't know anything about this, but I know that this person, I found them online, I'll contact them. I already have some kind of relationship with them, and just ask them, just say, hey, I'm doing on this story. Do you have anybody that you think I should talk to? A great place to get data that is actually very user-friendly is ARDA, the Archive for American Religious Data Archive. Anyway, if you type in ARDA, it'll pop up, ARDA and religion, it'll pop up. And if you haven't used that, it's a great site. It's got some funding from Templeton, but it's kind of a big, major site. And it has all sorts of things that you can look at, both research, but they have things on denominations. They have all kinds of data that's already there. They have surveys that they have archived there, but they have they can give you just the descriptives, like here's how many people in these surveys answered things. Google Scholar is a great place to be looking for people. So if you type in just the topic that you're working on in Google Scholar, what it'll do is it'll pop up books and academic journals that publish and have published on that topic, and you can look to see if ones that are there. What I would do is just like not worry about I wouldn't use this to go in and read it because it might be something that's too specific, but look and see who the authors are and then contact the authors and see if they'd be willing to talk to you about your topic. You could do the same thing on Twitter where you're searching for people, or contact people or ask them on Twitter. JSTOR is another academic site that you can search, kind of like Google Scholar, but it has just journal articles. And then Pew and PRRI are two organizations that are geared towards communicating, but they're also good at letting you know who you might want to communicate with. The biggest thing on kind of what should you say whenever you're talking to somebody who's an academic, who's an expert in the field, but may not be very good at communicating, probably haven't talked to a journalist in a long time, aren't thinking that way. So here's some advice from kind of the other side of the office door, you might say, is the key thing is to explain what you're trying to do and what you're looking for and what you need. And I would start off with some general background kind of questions. Say that if you're doing an article on something, or you're doing a press release, or whatever it is that you're doing, and that you're trying to get some background and just want to just talk to them about things. I have here talk at a freshman level. And what I mean by that is, and you can even just tell them this, just say, imagine I was just someone in kind of an intro class of yours. How would you explain this to me? If you start to, even if you picked up, or even if you're very comfortable with using academic language or very specific terms, sometimes that can, I've heard some science writers talk about this. They'll get enough knowledge that they sound like they know what they're talking about, and then the person will start talking in this jargon and other words that all of a sudden they're lost in it. And so, but talking at a freshman level or talking to students is something that professors and writers, who are academic writers, do all the time. And so they understand how to communicate to students. If they're talking to someone that they think might have the same background as them, then they go to a different level on different things. So one of the things that you can do is just ask dumb questions, right? So just say, look, I have some background in this, but I'm going to ask something. And you can even just say, I'm just going to ask kind of simple questions, just to kind of make sure that I really understand this. But what you're trying to get at is try to get them to explain, what's the big picture? What do we see as the pattern that we go on? What's our data? Don't be surprised if they go, look, that's a great question. We don't really have an answer to that. But try to get at the descriptives. And the descriptives here, I mean like the data that helps describe or can help illustrate what we know as a general pattern. So it might take some really deep, rigorous research to really get at what the truth is. But if you talk to an expert that says, look, this is what's really going on, but here's how you can kind of communicate that. Here's a graph that kind of illustrates that. That's something that you can really find useful. Okay, that's kind of went through that, I know, really quick, but wanted to go through it and then just see what kind of questions you guys have. Does that sound good, Bud?
That sounds great. I will start going to some questions that we've had in the chat box. If you're with us online, please just submit a question in the chat box and I'll start feeding some of them to Tobin here. If you're with us on the phone, hang on just a little bit longer and we'll go to opening you. Tobin, you have a camera on as well?
I can.
Yeah, okay. I think your camera wasn't on.
Yep.
So
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, because I was just doing that, but yeah.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Just so I think people like to see you.
Oh yeah, no, it's fine.
So we had a very simple question that started off, which when somebody got excited, I did as well. You had that lovely graph where you showed the transitions that have happened in Southern Baptists, and we're seeing the threads. And it was a practical question, a pragmatic one, which is, what tool did you use to help create that graph? It's
No, that one is one. There is a feature on Google that I'll have to remember what it's called here. Google Charts, I think.
One of the advanced tools of Google allows you to do it?
Yeah. And what it does is, yeah, and so it's and they have a chart gallery.
Wow.
So it takes a little bit, and that one is called. Let me see if I pulled it up here. Yes, that is called if I remember right.
Sankey, I thought was the
Sankey. Yeah, Sankey.
Okay.
And what you'll see is, yeah, so this is one where, but if you have even a little bit of experience with HTML or other something like that, that's what I used to create it. It wasn't that complicated. In fact, part of the fun of that one was just figuring out how to do it a little bit, but that's what that was.
A fabulous tip. We had a question from Catherine. She was asking about, what do you think about graphs versus infographics? I got excited personally about infographics, just in terms of how they think about more creatively pulling out or extracting the particulars that you want to convey from research. And I think sometimes the graphs that I've seen from people that are doing early stages of research and are sort of new to the field are too dense with too much information, and they're hard to read necessarily. So obviously there's an obvious difference, but you have a preference of one or the other in terms of conveying information?
No, and this is something that even in academic journals, they're moving more towards, they wouldn't call it infographic, but going more towards graphic and focusing in on what is the particular thing that you want to focus on. Mm-hmm. But the way that you can balance this out is oftentimes that, let's say if there's a long table that has all the data in it, see if you can somehow archive that or put that in the end or make it available on a website somewhere. So if that 1 or 5% that really wants to get into the weeds of it, but instead focus on what is it that's really important. And I think that that's also important as communicators, because if you can't do that, then maybe you don't know what you're talking about, right? And so now there might be some things like I had with that ideological map that I had, where you're like, look, I'm trying to show you all the data and let you just kind of sit there and explore it. But a lot of times it's like, no, this is the part I want you to focus in on. And so just trying to focus in on those data points.
Mm-hmm. Renee and I both were wondering about your go-to resources for surveys and research. And you enumerated in your one graph there towards the end of your Prezi, Pew, PRRI, ARDA, so forth. I also have used HIRR up at Hartford Seminary, Baylor Research, Barna Research, and so forth. And I know from talking, I know it's a small world amongst statisticians and folks within religious circles who do this, so they all largely know one another, and there's an association, and they have differences as to how one's better or the other amongst themselves. And some of it has to do with like the level of the number of people that they're willing to allow to be, surveyed, the way in which the survey is, taken, and whether that's legitimate or not. There's a whole series of things, and I'm curious just knowing if there's others beyond those three that you had mentioned. I also had known that like there's independent researchers like Brian Grimm, who had previously been with one of the big ones. And there's also global outfits that do research that like produce the Global Peace Index and Global Terrorism Index that have religious related material in them. So are there other resources beyond those that you mentioned?
Sure. Yeah. I think honestly, for people who are doing communication like you're doing, all of those are fantastic. I think the differences that we have and arguments that we have academically are really in the weeds kind of thing, that they really aren't that important. But I'll give you two. Let me, if I could pull up let's see, how do I pull up my page again?
You have to stop sharing the screen.
Okay, so hit stop share.
Yep.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. And then, wait, no, I want to share the screen. Okay.
Then you can pick up the item that you want to share.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm good at this. Yeah.
Okay. While you're looking at that, I'll just tell folks that are on the line that I looked, it's September 19th is our next webinar with Ryan Koch, and it's at 1 p.m. Eastern time. It's taking your social media presence to another level. So we have a webinar that's planned for September 19th at 1 o'clock Eastern time with Ryan. He had done this presentation at the New York conference a little more than a year ago for Religion Communicators Council. and so we're inviting him to come back and do it in a webinar form because it was a highly popular workshop. So we're making it.
That was great.
Fun.
All right, so one is a general social survey, and if you type in SDA, it's something data analysis and SDA, and it'll come up with this Berkeley site, and you can hit the cumulative data that's down here. And what's nice about it, it'll pop up, is that this allows you to do some data analysis yourself using a general social survey, and you can look in the code book, but I think like, I'm trying to remember if it's RailTrad or what do we do? So like religion. Okay, this is kind of the general religion question. They have a more specific one that's there, but you can put that over here, and then they always have like, sorry, they got one that's like, do you think homosexuality is wrong or not? And they have these weird names like homosex, sorry, but it's like there. And then you can say, okay, I want this to do a row chart, and oops, can't get down to it. And then it'll tell you, okay, all right, so since 1970s, 23% of Catholics, I think it's right, say it's always wrong, 67% of Protestants. No, wait, it's going, yeah, it's like that. And it's got these different ones. So so it's got a lot of religion questions on there. So that's GSS. If you type in SDA, it allows you to do some stuff yourself. The other
SDA at the Berkeley site, and it has a general social survey, and anybody can put in some parameters to see what actually is included in the general survey.
Yeah. And if you play around with it, it's really not, it looks a little wonkier than it is. It's actually very easy to use. The other one is if you type in World Value Survey. World Value Survey is a data set. It's kind of like the General Social Survey, but it's done internationally. It has been since the 1980s. And it's got a thing too where you can do data and documentation, and you can say, okay, I want to do some online analysis. Should come up. Yeah, and so you can say, okay, I want to do the latest wave of it, and I want to see what things are like in Haiti, and what I want to ask about. And then they've got all these different things, and so that you can have a thing like how satisfied you are with your life. Thing here.
You can cross-reference it with church membership or something.
Yep. Yeah, they have some basic. The religion questions go with kind of. There is. I don't know why it's not. Oh, here's different ones.
I feel like I'm riding a bicycle and you're showing me how to drive a Ferrari.
Sorry.
No, it's looking at some of the details of it. It's amazing what it is that it can
and
do.
so, and the bigger thing is just know that it's out there and you can play around with it. But they put these up here, that SDA, and they put this one for people like you or people who might be, maybe undergraduates are doing stuff. They're not doing this for other academic things, but I'll use this a lot because like on the GSS site, there's these things that you have to do, like they're technical things like weighting the data or other things. They've got it all set up for you. And so I think I'm back now. So things that they're ready, they have it back and kind of ready for you to use. And so it's all set up for you.
Cam Howard asked us, can you talk a bit about how you decide how to present the data? For example, what do you consider when choosing what kind of chart or graphic to use to display the data and make it easily understood? And what tools do you use recommending for creating data visualizations? So you had showed us how you use the Google tool there to create the one chart, but otherwise, what other tools?
Yeah, honestly, most of the graphs that I use Excel or some other spreadsheet program. You can actually do a lot with them because when you're using those, it allows you to do it. There's a couple of rules to consider whenever you're doing the presenting data. And Tufty is a name of a guy who's really looked at this. You try to keep it as simple as possible, right? So one of the kind of things is if you're putting stuff on there and it looks nice, but does it help communicate things? So if you're adding colors, right? If you have bars with different colors on it, the reader is going to be thinking, okay, what do those colors mean? And sometimes, if you're doing a pamphlet or something, you have different infographic type stuff, the kind of classic USA Today corner bar chart of like someone literally holding a pizza with slices being what type of toppings people want, in the size of the slice or something like that. But in general, you want to try to keep it as simple as possible. And really try to think of it as you should be someone who's doing the graphic should edit it the same way that they edit their own writing, right? As you become an expert in it, you might be able to get through it in 1 or 2 drafts, but you should treat it as a graph, have someone else look at it. And one of the goals should be, can you hand this to somebody and just say, okay, here's what it's on. Can they figure out and tell you what it's about? Just like if you gave them a piece of writing and said, here, tell me about it. If they can't communicate that back to you, then it's probably not there. So is the title clear, or do you have enough labels on it? And I'm talking about like non-experts, like the people that you would be sending it to, who would be reading it. Could they interpret what you're talking about?
Mm-hmm. You may not want to answer this question, but it's what the sources to avoid, or the sources that have a bad reputation for accuracy or relevance. And that may not be something you want to put on the record. You might speak maybe to anything you might want to look for that is a problem. Like if they don't demonstrate certain things about how they got the data or that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah.
Also, and that is a related question, perhaps you want to answer this as well, is how to assess the credibility of data supplied or crunched by denominational groups or religious institutions who may have an agenda in displaying data in certain ways. I've recalled sitting together, I think, with you at a Religion News Association meeting where a particular group came and presented information that is religiously affiliated. And I saw the people in the room that are statisticians that have more of an independent status kind of scoffing at it, and some of the journalists scoffing at it, feeling as though that the numbers were inflated or skewed in a certain way as to represent what it is that the organization wanted journalists to think.
Yeah, or they can just be bad at it.
So how are they bad at it? How do
I'll tell you. I'll give you. Southern Baptists had this where they were counting for a while how many baptisms were going on in missionary fields. So they'd send missionaries out, and it turned out that these missionaries, to keep those numbers up, were baptizing like 6 or 7 per day. And the reason was because they were. No one was being dishonest. It was like, well, how many baptisms? And they would just kind of let anyone report. So it's kind of doing what everybody in that area was doing, not just them. And so they had to recorrect that. So if you look at their charts, they have like this thing, and then you can notice it because also around about 10 years ago, all of a sudden it plummets. Either they started really being bad at their job, or what it was they were counting it correctly. I would say most of the data stuff, from denominations usually are okay, because they're giving you the best data that they know how to get. But you do have to keep in mind, like if they say that they have so many members, that means something you guys know this, but it means something very different depending on which denomination you're talking about, how they're counting their numbers. Do they ever take anyone off the list? Is there an official list, or is it just kind of a general count kind of thing? But in general, I would say if you can't, and they don't provide somewhere the details on how they got their data, then I would be very suspicious about it. And so if it's a poll, if someone's doing a survey, if they say, okay, this percentage of people think that the Bible is inerrant or something. All right, can you give me, what is the question that they asked, right? And somewhere, and oftentimes someone like Pew or PRI or some other ones who are used to doing this very publicly won't put that stuff in their kind of press release or their main story, but they will have a link to their big full report, right? The other thing too is that if you ask them if they say that something's available and they say, oh, we don't provide that, then I would get suspicious on some of that stuff, or just realize, okay, if they're not willing to provide it to me, maybe I shouldn't report it out as well.
Yeah, if they don't reveal all the data, or they don't show you how it is that they ask the questions, it makes me nervous. And I love the fact that, like for a Pew or PRI, you can click on it and look, because they do their highline report or their executive summary that they want you to know. but I actually find often, if I just look, I actually think that there are other questions to me that are more interesting. It might be a different story. I know some reporters are very good at doing that, looking at what the other bits of the data that haven't been told yet. And it seems as though those kinds of organizations actually sometimes string out the storytelling from what their data says, so that they're telling one frame of a story at a certain time, and then later they go back to the same data and mix it against some other data and tell you a different story, basically, about what this.
Right. Yeah. When I was working at CT, I would do this a lot, where Pew would put out something, and I knew that Pew would ask the religion questions in there, except for some of their economic surveys. But and I would just call them up and or email and just say, hey, can I get the breakdown by religious group? And some of their stuff was, they would just give me the raw printout from their things, but I knew how to read it as well. And so they knew that I knew how to read the table, but they were willing to provide it if you're willing to do it. And so I always had this kind of one angle to it. Like, I wanted to get the religion angle on it. And it may not be the report that they were doing it on immigration or something like that, but I knew that they had this other data, so I could then have that data point. And they were always willing to help those out.
Okay, I'm actually at this point in our conversation together going to do the crazy thing of trying to unmute everyone. That could backfire on us. In order to make it so that anybody who's joining us by phone might be able to actually ask a question as well, in addition to those that have been asked. So here goes. I may have to undo it if it doesn't work, but.
And basically, while you've been repeating your same kind of point.
So we have one person that's in the background there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
So that's really what we're trying to get at here.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's a very helpful update. Thank you for that. I think that will be definitely
okay.
Give us something to be attuned for and wait and help.
All right, you there, bud?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, everybody. There's somebody that's on. I can't identify who's actually speaking. I apologize for that. Sometimes happens. And I'm not able to see exactly who that was that's listening, but turned to another conversation. So it's interrupting our conversation with one another. One thing I will ask you is that I used to use the yearbook of American and Canadian churches that the National Council of Churches put out. And I found it a terrific resource. However, unfortunately, with the downsizing of the National Council of Churches a number of years ago, it's actually gone. And I'm not really clear. I use it as a go-to to figure out numbers and relations between denominations and things like that. I'm wondering what you find to be sort of the next comparable thing as such a resource. Is the Eileen Linder, who was there, actually went out, into Amish country and would, with a wax crayon and paper, collect the, information from the Amish, exactly how many there are and what categories of them and so forth. So where can I go to look for that same kind of data that you find to be relevant that would tell us pictures of U.S. Religious communities, exactly how many Methodists, how many Muslims, how many different kinds of what have you are out there?
Yeah, there isn't a lot. One of the bad parts about the way we have our census done is that we don't collect that kind of data on like our regular census, which is why they had to start doing that census themselves. Mm-hmm. But one of the ways where you can get some of that is Pew's landscape study. And I'm not sure about PRRI's, but with Pew's, their 2014 that came out, the data is available, and that has 35,000 people surveyed. And so you can get, especially if you're getting relative size. So, in terms of like Jewish population, you'd have 500 people that are in it. And they ask specifically, what type, not just are you Jewish, but okay, you're Jewish, but what type are you? Are you Reformed, Conservative, Orthodox, interfaith, cultural? Sorry, got dogs in the background.
That's okay.
And so that provides a lot, particularly for even some of the smaller denominations. So you might have some holiness denomination or something might have 100 people in it that are in the survey, or 50. But on the larger denominations, actually quite a bit of variation, and with more information than you would have in that resource. And in some ways, it's a little bit better because it's requiring where people are how people in a survey respond, and whereas with some of the other ones that you're mentioning, they are relying on the denominations to do it, and some denominations are better than others. Presbyterian Church USA, great data getting in. Kojic, not so sure, because you can look at their. The only reason I mentioned theirs is like theirs tends to jump up in big chunks and stays flat for a while, and just some are better than others, depending on their size and some other things.
So Tobin, before we go, can you tell us some of the places we can follow your work? I was following you on Twitter. I know you have a piece on Church and State with RNS. Can you tell us some of the places we should be looking for?
Yeah, Twitter would probably be the best case, even though the past few months I've been griping about Trump more than anything else. But
what's your handle?
Just at Tobin Grant.
Okay.
It's a nice thing about having a name like that. Didn't have to go too fancy. If you ever need to ask me a question, probably the best place is just to email my SIU address. It's just Grant, just my last name at siu.edu. I'll also just give you my Gmail address too. It's just tobingrant@gmail.com. But yeah, no, the place where I'm most public is on Twitter. You can also message me there as well.
That's terrific. I thank you so much for taking time to be with us today, for putting together such a clever presentation. We are recording what it is that we're sharing here with the webinar, so we will post it up on the RCC website and then share that back out on social media with people so they can actually see it. I know myself and a few of the people that were chatting in the chat box are having trouble absorbing it all, drinking, from a fire hydrant when you.
Okay, yeah, sure.
It's a lot of information, and it's something that needs to be savored and perhaps looked at again. So it will be available on the RCC website. And perhaps your Prezi presentation could be offered separately.
Yes, yeah, I'll send you the link to that as well, and then you can share it with whoever you want.
Okay. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Again, our next webinar is September 19th with Brian Cope at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And appreciate you all joining with us. We had a healthy crowd on today. Thanks.
Great, thank you.